On August 6th and 9th, 1945, the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The destruction was immense. However, despite the devastation brought by nuclear weapons, Chinese leader Mao Zedong did not see these weapons as decisive in wars. He viewed them as a very powerful tool, but they did not scare China or the Chinese army. He even described the atomic bomb as just a paper tiger. He said that the outcomes of wars depend on the people and their courage in fighting, not just on weapons. When the leaders of major countries, especially Western nations, heard these statements, they thought Mao Zedong was downplaying nuclear weapons or that he didn't really understand what he was talking about. This was fine with them. They preferred he stay away from nuclear weapons. However, in the early 1950s, Mao Zedong visited the Soviet Union. At that time, Stalin showed him a documentary about the successful test of the first Soviet atomic bomb to demonstrate its capabilities. Stalin pointed out that the Soviet Union could provide a nuclear umbrella to protect China and other socialist bloc countries. This was enough for the Chinese, and they did not strive to acquire nuclear weapons at that time. They might have remained uninterested in nuclear weapons if it weren't for what the United States did to them from 1950 to 1955. What did America do to China that made China see no goal other than acquiring nuclear weapons? How did Mao Zedong persuade the Soviets to help him with something like this? Did they really help him? That's what we will discuss in today's episode. In the 1950s, during the Korean War, China saw a real comparison between its capabilities and America's military capabilities, especially when America repeatedly threatened to use nuclear weapons against China. The first instance was in 1950, when President Harry Truman ordered the transfer of 10 B-29 bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons to the Pacific to intimidate China and prevent it from intervening in the Korean War. In 1952, President Eisenhower publicly hinted at the possibility of using nuclear weapons against China if there was no progress in the Korean War armistice talks. In 1954, a U.S. Air Force general expressed support for resorting to nuclear weapons if China resumed fighting in Korea. Finally, in January 1955, a U.S. Navy officer publicly called for the use of nuclear weapons if China invaded South Korea. It felt like America spent the first half of the 1950s threatening China with nuclear weapons, practicing what was later described as nuclear coercion. During this time, America developed tactical nuclear weapons and the hydrogen bomb in 1952, which was much more destructive than the regular atomic bomb. They deployed most of these weapons in South Korea, Taiwan, Guam, and Hawaii. This meant China was somewhat surrounded by deadly weapons, and the gap between China and the major powers was widening significantly. The feeling of being encircled was exacerbated by the first Taiwan Strait crisis in the mid-1950s, when China bombed some Taiwanese islands in an attempt to reunite with Taiwan. The Americans intervened due to the defense treaty between the United States and Taiwan, moving the 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait, creating a major crisis that showed China its true standing on the international stage. Regarding international status, China was excluded from most of the world's most important international councils. Despite being one of the 5 major powers after World War II with a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, when the Communist Revolution occurred and Mao Zedong took control of the mainland China, the nationalist government fled to Taiwan and claimed to be the official representative of China. The West recognized the government in Taiwan, and it took the international status and Security Council seat that belonged to China, leaving Mao's mainland China largely isolated internationally. Due to this lost international status and American nuclear coercion, Mao Zedong's views on nuclear weapons began to change. He became determined to develop nuclear weapons by any means necessary. So, how did Mao convince the Soviets to help him with this? Although Stalin refused to help China with this matter, things changed a bit after Stalin's death when Nikita Khrushchev came to power. Khrushchev had different ideas, such as wanting to open up to the West and reduce international tensions, but these were not easy tasks in the Soviet Communist Party. At the beginning of Khrushchev's rule, he did not have full control and needed political battles to secure his position. To do this, he decided to improve relations with China and Mao Zedong. During his visit to China in October 1954, Mao expressed interest in nuclear energy and weapons, seeking Soviet assistance in establishing China's nuclear program. This request surprised Khrushchev, who tried to persuade Mao to focus on economic development instead, promising Soviet nuclear protection. Mao did not accept this, so Khrushchev agreed to help build a small nuclear research reactor for training and peaceful research. China agreed, seeing it as a starting point. Fortunately for China, during the crisis in Hungary, Poland, and with the Soviet Communist Party in 1956 to 1957, Mao stood by Khrushchev, who decided to reciprocate by helping China develop an atomic bomb. In 1957, Nikita Khrushchev decided to reciprocate Mao Zedong's support by helping him develop a Chinese atomic bomb. New agreements were made, and the Soviet Union committed to providing an educational model of the atomic bomb with complete blueprints, helping to establish a chemical separation plant. They also agreed to sell industrial equipment for producing enriched uranium, provide uranium hexafluoride to start the enrichment process once the plant was operational, and assist in establishing an atomic energy institute in China. Additionally, the Soviet Union would build several other nuclear research facilities and send delegations of Chinese to be trained in the Soviet Union. The Soviets also promised to send about 1,000 specialists to China to help the Chinese, a number that would later increase. So, what did China do on its side? Initially, China began working on recalling its scientists from abroad. Some students, both inside and outside China, began changing their majors to align with the new Chinese direction. The government also ordered its students studying in Europe and America to return immediately after graduation. Among those returning to China was a Chinese nuclear physicist who graduated from the California Institute of Technology and was a professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. This man played a very important role in developing the Chinese nuclear program. China also restructured its economy to align with nuclear development goals. Despite the problems this caused China, this was Mao Zedong's vision. He would not allow anyone to threaten or scare China. By 1958 to 1959, China had begun to stand on its feet in the field of nuclear weapons, all with full Soviet assistance. But this help wouldn't last long due to what the Chinese did to the Soviets in the second half of 1958. What happened? In 1958, China launched an intensive attack on some islands in the Taiwan Strait in an attempt to control them and get rid of the Chinese government there, to reunite China and regain their international standing. Of course, America did not remain silent, and this led to what was known as the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis, which was bigger than the first crisis in 1954. At that time, China was closer than ever to an American nuclear strike. The problem was that China's actions angered the Soviet Union greatly. As an ally, China was expected to consult the Soviets before taking military actions, but this did not happen. Moreover, the Soviets were blamed by the international community for China's actions, which greatly annoyed Khrushchev during a time when he was trying to reduce tensions with the West. Khrushchev also became more fearful and worried about what Mao Zedong would do once he had nuclear weapons, given what he had already done without them. This was the first point that angered the Soviets. The second point that greatly upset them and broke trust between the two countries was when China bombed the Taiwanese islands. Taiwan retaliated by hitting China with new missiles called Sidewinders. One of these missiles landed in China without exploding. The Soviets told the Chinese that they needed this missile because it was a great treasure and they could make good use of it. The missile was said to be the most advanced air weapon of its time, containing new technology in the world of missiles, with secrets the Soviets wanted at any cost. However, China initially did not comply with the Soviet request and later said they could not hand over the missile because they were studying it. This response greatly angered Khrushchev, who was obsessed with technology and missile technology. After several months, the Chinese handed over the missile to the Soviets, but it was disassembled and missing the most important parts related to sensing and guidance. This made the Soviets suspect that the Chinese were not honest with them and had kept the important parts for themselves. The Soviets later managed to get a complete version of the missile from the Americans through one of their spies, which is another story. But what China did at this point exhausted the Soviet patience. Therefore, in June 1959, Nikita Khrushchev canceled the 1957 agreement with China, announcing that he would not provide the promised atomic bomb prototype. He also stated that he would adhere to the nuclear test ban treaty with the West, meaning he could not help China anymore. By August 1960, all Soviet specialists, who had numbered around 3,000, left China. Imagine China's situation at this point. After being close to obtaining the weapon that would place them on equal footing with the world's great powers and restore their international status, suddenly everything was taken away. This happened at a time when China was suffering from severe economic difficulties, poverty, famine, and massive spending on the nuclear research budget. Suddenly, all of this evaporated, and it was a huge insult to the Chinese, making them determined to continue the project and intensify their efforts to complete it, despite their great poverty. They were determined to continue even if they had to sell their underwear, as one Chinese official said at the time. So, what did they do at that time? Simply put, under immense political pressure, the Chinese began to operate Soviet equipment without fully understanding it. They had to make it work somehow, but this led to many disasters and accidents. It became clear that the project needed to be handled properly, scientifically, and methodically. Thus, they started a new project named 596, symbolizing the Soviet betrayal they faced in June 1959, to keep this betrayal always in their minds and achieve their goal. It's important to note that when the Soviets left, they did not leave the Chinese at zero stage. The Chinese had already reached a significant stage in their nuclear journey, and to continue and reach their goal on their own, they needed at least 5 to 10 years of self-learning to complete the difficult, long path. They actually took exactly 5 years. These 5 years were the hardest, with everyone striving and gathering all the notes they had taken from the Soviets. Even the torn pieces of paper left by the Soviet experts were collected and reassembled by the Chinese, who took whatever they could from them to overcome most obstacles independently. They spent $1.5 billion on this project, a huge amount taken from other development sectors during a time of famine and poverty. All this effort culminated on October 16, 1964. When China successfully conducted its first nuclear bomb test. To prove to the world that they had produced the enriched uranium for the bomb themselves, since the Soviets had given them only enough uranium for one test bomb, China conducted a second successful nuclear test on May 14, 1965, demonstrating their full production capabilities. According to one source, China had enough uranium for about 12 bombs. Less than 3 years later, on June 17, 1967, China successfully tested its first hydrogen bomb, which is much more terrifying than a regular atomic bomb. They achieved this in just 32 months from their first nuclear bomb test. By comparison, the United States took 86 months, the Soviet Union 75 months, Britain 61 months, and France 105 months to develop their hydrogen bombs, while China did it in 32 months, largely on their own. In the end, when we review the whole episode, we find that China developed nuclear weapons primarily due to two main reasons among many others. The first reason was American nuclear coercion and the continuous threat that the United States might use nuclear weapons against China. The second reason was the Soviet abandonment of China, which China saw as a major insult. Without these factors, China might not have been able to reach the capabilities it developed, allowing it to create different deadly weapons. You might say that if China had continued with Soviet support, the Soviets would have given them the atomic bomb and other major weapons. While this is true, Soviet assistance would have resulted in China having a nuclear bomb, but not the drive to push itself to develop and create new weapons. This is similar to giving a student the answer to a problem without having him think through it and feel its difficulty. The student might pass the test, but he won't be prepared for more challenging problems later. This idea is confirmed by political science expert Alex Montgomery in his research titled "Stop Helping Me," where he argues that most cases of foreign nuclear assistance tend to slow down local nuclear programs. Perhaps if China had continued with Soviet help, it never would have been able to build these weapons independently, and it would not have had the drive to develop further and create new weapons. This highlights the importance of self-reliance, much like the famous saying, "Give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime."